Hi y'all, I hope you had a really nice Easter with your families. For me, it's not Easter yet, it's the Saturday before, but by the time you see the video, it will be over, so I hope it was a good day for you. So we're gonna go on to our next lesson, which is solving trig equations, part 2. So you will need your note sheet, worksheet, and there's a formula sheet that I posted. So get all those things ready, and you will also need your graphing calculator. So let's get started. So you're going to be solving trig equations again, but these will turn out a little differently than the previous ones. So I want to show you why they're different. So look at number 1. So we have the cosine of x equals 1/4. So on the last lesson, you had a similar question, but what you did is you looked on your unit circle and you were trying to find angles whose cosine value was, and then whatever this number is. Well, the problem is if you look on your unit circle, you're not going to find any of the angles that match that. So we're going to use a formula and our calculator instead. Okay, so if you look on the formula sheet, it says that there will be an equation of this form, cosine of x equals a. That's what we have. 1/4 is the a. So just below that, you will see that there's a formula. There is positive and negative, inverse cosine, also called the arc cosine of a, and then plus or minus 2 pi any number of times. So that formula comes from the formula sheet that I attached. So you're going to need to do 2 things on your calculator. One is that you're going to do the inverse cosine of 1/4, and you may or may not need to add 2 pi to that. So just hold off on that for now. And then the other thing you're going to do is do the negative inverse cosine of 1/4. So the reason why I have both of these is because in the formula there's a plus and a minus. So that one is the plus and that one's the minus. So this is what we're going to need our calculator to figure out. Okay, so go ahead and get your calculator ready. So I'm going to need to set down the whiteboard and go to my calculator. Now what I found with my calculator is if I showed it to you on my video, it didn't show up. It was very hard to see. So instead, I found a computer program that has our calculator. So I'm going to use that instead and hope it goes better. So on the left, you will see this is what your calculator looks like, but the display is going to appear over here. So one thing you want to make sure is that your calculator is in the correct mode. So mode is right over here by the second key. And we've been on the screen before. You want to make sure that your calculator is in radians. The reason why I know that is because it says to solve over the interval 0 to 2 pi, so that implies radians. Okay, so once it's in radian mode, you want to get out of that screen, and we're going to be doing the inverse cosine. So you're going to press second cosine, that brings up the arc cosine, and you're going to put in 1/4 inside the parentheses, and press enter. So you're going to see 1.318. So before you put it down as one of your answers, you have to make sure that it falls between 0 and 2 pi. So what is 2 pi? Well, if you're not sure, put in 2 in the calculator and then the pi symbol. Pi is over here on the far right. It's with the exponent button, but you have to press second. So it's second and then pi right there. So if I press enter, it shows you that 2 pi is roughly 6.283. So you want to make sure that every answer you give falls between 0 and 6.283. So our answer, 1.318, is fine, so that works. Okay, so the other one you want to do is the second half of the formula. So you're going to have to do the, oops, I pressed the wrong thing, sorry. You're going to have to press the negative inverse cosine and still put 1/4 in the parentheses. So what you will find is that you got the same answer that you did up here, but it's a negative. So the thing is, this number is not between 0 and 2 pi. So you would not be able to keep that answer the same. So what you will have to do is add 2 pi to that answer. So you will put plus 2 and then the pi symbol and then enter. So then you get the answer 4.965. So that does fall between 0 and 6.283. So one of your solutions would be the top one, 1.318, and then the next one would be the one on the bottom, 4.965. So those would be the 2 answers for question number 2. So let me go back and, or question number 1, sorry. So go back and write those down. So one answer was 1.318, and your second answer is 4.965. Both of those fall between 0 and 2 pi, so they would be your solutions. So number 1 is finished. Remember, you can pause and restart when you're ready. So number 2, we've got the sine of x equals -3/5. So on your formula sheet, you'll see that it says that the equation might be in the form sine of x equals a, where a is -3/5. So there is a formula below it, and you will see it has two parts. So it's the inverse sine of a plus or minus 2 pi n, and then there's a second half that says pi minus inverse sine of a plus or minus 2 pi n. So we're going to have to do both parts. So since a is -3/5, you will do the inverse sine of -3/5, and we may or may not have to add 2 pi to that. And then the other one would be pi minus the inverse sine of -3/5. And again, we may or may not have to add 2 pi. So these are the two things we're going to do on our calculator in just a minute. So again, I'm going to put the whiteboard down and go back to the calculator. Okay, so you're going to press inverse sine, so that's second sine. Brings up the inverse, and then you'll put in the parentheses -3/5. So you should see the answer gives you -0.643. Okay, so this solution does not work because it does not fall between 0 and 2 pi, so that is not allowed. So on this one, we will have to add 2 pi. Oops, I pressed it twice. So you're going to add 2 pi to that. So 2 pi symbol and enter. So you'll find that you get 5.639 and so on. So that one is good. It does fall between 0 and 2 pi, and we'll round it to the thousandths place. So that would be 5.640. Okay, then we would do the second half of the formula, and we would do pi. Go to the second, and then pi is over here, not negative pi, erase that, sorry. So pi minus the inverse sine of -3/5. And you would get 3.785. So that one is a good solution too, because it's between 0 and 2 pi. So those last two would be the two answers for this question. So one solution was 5.640, and the next one would be 3.785. So these would be our answers for question 2. All right, so number 3 is the tangent of x equals 3. So that follows the form tangent of x equals a. So a is 3. So on your formula sheet, it says that you will do the inverse tangent of a, and you might have to add or subtract pi any number of times. So in this case, we're going to do the inverse tangent of 3, and we may or may not have to add pi. So I'm going to now go to the calculator. So back over here. I apologize for all the movement back and forth, but this is really the only way I can show you the calculator part. So we'll just make do. All right, so we have to do, let me clear this out. We have to do the inverse tangent of 3. and enter. Okay, so you get 1.249, perfectly good answer because it falls between 0 and 2 pi. But there might be more solutions, and notice that the formula is to add pi. So it's not 2 pi this time, it's pi. And the reason for that is the tangent function has a period of pi, whereas sine and cosine have a period of 2 pi. So the answer that you should get would be 4.391 if you round it. So those are the two solutions for number 3. So 1.249 and also 4.391. So number 3 is finished. Okay, number 4 is next. So it is 2 sine of x minus 3 equals 0. So this is the type where you have to do a little bit of algebra before you go to your calculator. And be careful on the algebra. Some of you on the last lesson made some really careless errors on the algebra part, which then messed up the rest of your problem. So just watch out on that. So here you would want to add 3. So that would be 2 sine of x equals 3. And then you would also divide by 2. So you would get sine of x equals 3/2. Okay, so then you would apply the formula. And there are 2 parts to this. So there would be the inverse sine of 3/2. And we may or may not have to add 2 pi to that. And the other one is pi minus the inverse sine of 3/2. And we may or may not have to add 2 pi. We'll see. So these are the 2 things we're going to do on our calculator. Okay, so if I do the inverse sine of 3/2, you're going to see that something strange happens on the calculator. It would be this message. It says error domain, and then below that it says the value entered is not allowed in the function or command. So you have to remember back when we were doing graphing and when we were doing inverses, sine and cosine and tangent each have different domains and ranges. So if the number you're using doesn't match the domain or range, then that means you'll get error messages. So here's the recap. Anytime you have sine or cosine and you're doing inverses, the number that you're using has to fall between -1 and 1. And if it's inverse tangent, it can be any number, -infinity to infinity. So because our number 3/2 is more than 1, that's why you're getting this error message. So that's going to come up sometimes, so don't worry, that's just something that's not allowed in this function. Okay, so back to the problem. If you use your calculator and you get that error domain message, that means that you can't solve the equation. And the same thing would have happened with this one. You can't do pi minus this because this number is greater than 1. So you were asked to solve the equation, so you would need to write that there is no solution to that equation. And that may happen on the assignment that you do shortly. Okay, so those are the basics. The other 3 that are listed are the ones where you have to do some factoring before you get your answer. And when we did the last assignment, a lot of you had problems with factoring. Remember, factoring is something that you learned in both Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. So all those skills that you learned in the past, they still have to be used in higher math. So I will definitely go through it all, but refer back to Algebra 1 and 2 skills. Okay, so we have to figure out how to factor this equation. Now remember that factoring is the reverse of FOIL. That's what I'm going to try to do here. So I want to get at the beginning 4 sine squared x. So 2 things are possible. It could be that one of them is 4 sine of x and the other one is 1 sine of x. Or it could be that one is 2 sine of x and the other one is 2 sine of x. Either way, if you did the first part of FOIL, you would get 4 sine squared. So So then you have to look at the last number, -1, and think of its factors. So the only possibilities are 1 and -1. So you want to kind of play around with it and think how you're going to be able to get the -3 that you need in the middle. So let's try something. So what if I were to put the negative sign here and the positive sign here? Let's see if that would work. So if I were to do the rest of FOIL, it would be 4 times 1, that would be 4, and then -1 would be in the middle, and 4 minus 1 would be +3. So that wasn't the one I was looking for. But what if you switched it around? What if you put a positive here and a negative over here? Let's try that. So the outside would be 4 times -1, that's -4, and then the inside would be 1 times that, so that would be positive. So -4 plus 1 would be -3. So that is the one that we needed. And if that one didn't work, then you try down here. Try 1 and -1 on your other possible answer. Okay, so that is factored. So in your last assignment, you took your factors and set them equal to 0. So we're going to do that here as well. And solve each equation. And again, be careful of the little mistakes that you made last time. You're going to subtract the 1, and you're also going to divide by 4. So it would be sine of x equals -1/4. And over here you would get sine of x equals, and I'm going to add 1, so it would be +1. Then you're going to solve each of the equations. So you would use the formulas that are on your sheet. So the first one would be to do the inverse sine of a -1/4. And we may have to add or subtract 2 pi n. We would also have to do pi minus the inverse sine of -1/4. And we may have to add or subtract 2 pi n. And over here, we would have to do the inverse sine of 1 and possibly add or subtract 2 pi n. And also pi minus the inverse sine of 1 plus or minus 2 pi n. Okay, so everything is set up now. Then you would go to your calculator. And I'm not going to do that since I showed you so many times. But if you did the first one back here, that answer, the inverse sine of -1/4, you would get -0.253. So that number is not allowed because it doesn't fall between 0 and 2 pi. So you would need to add 2 pi to this answer. So if you did, you would get 6.031. And that is okay because that falls shorter of 6.283, which we needed. So the first one is no good because it's not in the correct interval, but this one is okay. If you were to do this one, pi minus the inverse sine of -1/4, you would get the answer 3.394. And that number is okay. It's in the correct interval. So for the first equation, we get 6.031 and also 3.394. If you were to put in your calculator the inverse sine of 1, you would get the answer 1.571. That works. And the interesting thing is, if you did the second one, pi minus the inverse sine of 1, you would find that it's exactly the same number. So you don't have to write it again. It's going to be 1.571 again. So this equation has 3 solutions. Okay, so for number 6, 5 cosine squared x minus 17 cosine x plus 6 equals 0. So again, think of factoring as FOIL in reverse. So in order to get the 5 cosine squared, one of them would have to be 5 cosine of x and the other one 1 cosine of x. And then you have to look at your final number 6. So the possibilities are 6 and 1 or possibly 3 and 2. So you have to think, how are you going to play with those and get -17 in the middle? So to save time, I'll just tell you what it is. This side would be -2, and this side would be -3. So if you were to do FOIL, it would make -17, because you would do 5 times -3, that's -15, and then -2 in the middle. So -15 minus 2 is -17, so that works. Okay, so then we are going to set each equation equal to 0. So on the first one, I would add 2 and divide by 5, so that would be the cosine of x equals 2/5. And on the second one, I would subtract 3, so I would have the cosine of x equals 3. Now refer to your formula sheet. So you'll need to do several things. One thing is to do the inverse cosine of 2/5, and you may or may not have to add 2 pi. And then you'll do the negative inverse cosine of 2/5, and you may or may not have to add 2 pi. And the same thing over here. You'll do the inverse cosine of 3, and you'll do the negative inverse cosine of 3. All right. So when you type in the first one, inverse cosine of 2/5, you get 1.159. And that's a good solution. It falls between 0 and 2 pi. When you type the second one in with the negative in the front, you're going to get this same number but negative, so that's no good. It has to be between 0 and 2 pi. So you want to take negative 1.159 and add 2 pi to that. So if you add 2 pi, you would get 5.124. Over here, if you're going to put in inverse cosine of 3, you should get that error domain message again. And the reason is because 3 is not between -1 and 1. So that means that's not allowed. And then the same thing would happen here if you plugged that one in. It would give you an error message. So both of those equations are not able to be solved, so they will not give you any more solutions. So you're only going to have 2 solutions this time, 1.159 and 5.124. Okay, so last one. 2 tangent squared x minus tangent x minus 3 equals 0. So again, it's factoring. So we have to think of FOIL in reverse. So to get the 2 tangent squared, one of them would have to be 2 tangent of x and the other one 1 tangent of x. To get -3, you could use +1 and -3, or it might be -1 and +3. You kind of have to play around with those factors and think, how are you going to get -1 in the middle? So if I were to put a -3 here and a +1 here, it works because the outside would be 2 times 1, that's 2, and then the inside would be -3, so 2 minus 3 would be -1. No other combination would give you -1 in the middle. So now we're going to set both of our factors equal to 0. And do algebra. And again, be careful on the algebra. Here I would add 3 and divide by 2. So the tangent of x would be 3/2. And over here, if I subtract 1, I would get the tangent of x equals -1. So then you will apply the formula, which is the inverse tangent of 3/2, and you might or might not add pi to it. And the second one would be the inverse tangent of -1, and you may or may not have to add 2 or pi. Remember, for tangent, it's pi, not 2 pi. Okay, so if you were to put the first one in your calculator, the inverse tangent of 3/2, you would get 0.983. Now this one is different than sine and cosine. With tangent, there's no restriction on what number is here, so it can be anything from -infinity to infinity. So you should never get that domain error for inverse tangent. So that solution is good, 0.983. Then I'm going to add pi to that number. So if I added pi to 0.983, I would get 4.124. If I were to do the second equation, do the inverse tangent of -1, your calculator would give you negative 0.785. The problem with that is the negative doesn't fall between 0 and 2 pi. So that means that one's no good. So to get more solutions, you would need to add pi to that. So take this answer and add pi. And when you do that, you get 2.356. And if you add pi again to that, you would get 5.498. So you keep on adding pi as many times as you can until it goes past 2 pi. So as long as the numbers are under 6.283, they work. So it's going to be 4 different answers this time. Here, 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 and here. Make sure you can see everything before I stop. So pause it if you need to. All right, so we're done with this lesson. Please try to work on the problems and submit them to me before the deadline so that you would have time to go back and make corrections and get everything done before the deadline. So love you guys. Hope you had a great Easter. I'm about ready to go color some eggs and do Easter stuff with my kids and have fun. So take care. Bye-bye.